but then he never arrived in Salt Lake, and nobody really knew where he had gone. There was some suspicion, but he was a pretty honorable person, so they didn't really think that he had just run off and taken it, because at that time a lot of people were sending money through the mail as well. Turns out in May of that year, they did find his plane intact up on the Kolob area near the reservoir at about, I don't know, 9,000 feet. So he had somehow managed to make his way back to Cedar, but missed the Cedar airport, and then somehow managed to land in a blizzard at 2:30 in the morning, plane intact. He secured the mail, and then he tried to get off of the mountain in the middle of the blizzard, only to get turned around, and he didn't make it. But they found him later on that summer. Some sheepherders found him. There are some interesting how to signal emergency if you do crash. People can read, or if you're in the plane and you're flying by, telling people you had an emergency, because it was a while before everyone had radios and knew the frequencies. The United Airlines Flight 608, this was the second deadliest commercial air incident in the U.S. at the time. This was 1947. There was a ignition in the baggage area, and they tried to land at the Bryce Airport. As you can see, this is the picture here of Bryce Airport at a later time. But they didn't make it. I believe there were 52 fatalities. That's 47 passengers and 5 crew. And again, the Civil Aeronautics Board investigated it. Basically, they realized that there was an issue if you overfilled the tank of the plane, it would spill a few gallons into the baggage claim area that would then get sucked up into the heater, and that would start a fire. So they recalled all of these planes, one of which was actually used by the president at the time. So this is just part of what was coming out of this, why is everything happening, and trying to figure out so it doesn't happen again. Aviation development and production facilities. Some of y'all from maybe in Washington County might be aware of Hurricane Mesa. There was a test facility up there in the 1950s. Again, pilots during World War II and Korean War were being shot down and ejecting, but there was really not a lot of safety for how they could land. There was almost only a 20% chance of survivability of being ejected from an aircraft at that point if you were going down. So they put a lot of money into this test track, and they actually set land speed records out there, and they put crash test dummies. Here's this guy being kind of funny with the crash test dummy head. Once they were tested enough, they actually then used chimpanzees at the time and launched them off of the mesa with parachutes and rescued them. So yeah, there's that. It's now like a private, I think it's all private now, but yeah, they were pretty interesting history if you look into it. Air terminals, so here's 1970 Cedar City. This is the control, the flight services station. So there wasn't really an airport. It was mostly control areas. You'd drive up, you'd get on a plane if you were flying out. This is the St. George Airport. This is actually the mesa that the technical college is on now. That was the original airport down there. And every year they would come out, sometimes twice a year, they'd come out with these charts here. And it was basically a map for pilots to have, because it didn't have computers. They didn't have a screen to know. So it was all compass bearing. It was all figuring out your own weight, load, and how far you could go with the weather. And so there's a whole list of all of the places that you could land if you needed to, and the services there, the type of runway, and hopefully the runway could hold the type of plane you were going to land there. Kind of funny, in 1928 is when the airstrip here in Cedar opened, or 1929 actually. It was May 18th, and only 4 days later, somebody had already tried to steal an airplane. It basically, it says that they were leaving bad checks, they were issuing bad checks, so they got arrested for that. Then they left the sheriff's office, because I guess you could do that just on your own back then, I don't know. And then they tried to get in an airplane. They taxied around the airport for about 20 minutes and couldn't figure out how to get it off the ground, I guess. Then they held up in a cab until they found them. So, yeah, it's just kind of funny stories like that you know, part of the history that kind of get left in that 1929 issue of the Iron County Record, unless you go back and find it. Aids to navigation, though, is going to be the biggest thing that we have on our public lands. These are basically lighthouses, inland lighthouses. They were by the same group that was using lighthouses on the coast. And they use the same concept, have a big bright light high above the surface so you can let people know what not to run into. And they give them charts of everything. So this is the St. Louis Airways radio station, 1929. They actually had all these comics out, basically like, watch out, there are, you know, going to be bright lights showing up on your horizon. This is what they are, you know. This person's fixing big beacon. These are, and we'll get more into it, but here's the concrete arrows. Some folks may be more aware of because they're kind of unique. There aren't a lot of them out there, and they would have had a generator shack on them, a tower with a beacon on the top, and the generator shack would have powered the light. It would have rotated it. It would have powered the radio on there as well, and the arrow. It was meant to be flown both ways, so I don't really understand why they only put the arrow one way, but hopefully that didn't confuse anybody when they were flying. And then I just love these old photos. They actually, the Airways Division of the Department of Commerce had very specific pants style. So you could get the, if you couldn't order them, you could basically send them to your local tailor, and they would make you pants if you were contracted to be part of this. That's pretty cool. Some other types of beacons that don't necessarily have a generator shack. You've got an acetylene beacon here. There's a lot of these out between Windover and Salt Lake. So most of those are on military base now. But basically it was just controlled. It would light up at night as a flashing beacon. This is another example of one. The acetylene would have been down in the bottom. And then this one would have gone on top of a windmill. So in places where it was very windy or consistently windy, they would have those. They wouldn't have to keep going out and fixing the generator. So this is 1923. This is only 5 years after World War I, and this is the first proposed airway system in the U.S. Predates the interstate system, and they were trying to figure out which were the hubs and how to get to them all. So as you can see, here they actually put Las Vegas. They put Beaver as the main stop between Salt Lake and Las Vegas. Beaver did not end up becoming the main stop. Milford actually became the first. The main stop in this particular area, it was the first runway on that route in Utah. So here's just a kind of the area. I'll point you out. Here's St. George down here. Here's Cedar City. Beaver is right here. Milford's out here. So this was 1921. And this was basically, I don't know, instructions on the back of a napkin on how to get from Las Vegas to Milford. A pilot would have just had this, and they had their compass, and here's a dry lake bed that you can use for reference. Follow the railroad. Here's some in Barclay, which is in Lincoln County, Nevada. There's some fields you could land in, and you really are desperate. They're probably not going to have fuel. And then it says, once you get to Milford, just do a circle around the town a couple times. They'll see you because there's not many planes at that time, and they'll come out and refuel you. This was all before 1928. And it mostly was to do with the contract airmail, which was route number 4. And that was only the 4th in the nation. These are collectible items. This was mail that went out on the first flight of this from Las Vegas, it looks like. Los Angeles to Las Vegas. And there were, a lot of these areas were withdrawn for other uses at the time. So where they wanted to put a beacon or where they wanted to put an arrow, basically it now was solely used by the Department of Commerce. So all other grazing or mineral rights or anything like that, were no longer, in use.
So when you say contract,
Yeah.
was there different contracts for different routes?
Different routes had different
Different
contracts.
companies?
So,
There wasn't a big company that,
no, there was probably a couple, like this Western Air Express had the contract route through, through Utah. But they may have had one or two other ones, but basically it probably had to do with where they were based out of. And all of this was up and coming because commercial flight was very new, so nobody was doing the passenger, at the time. Then in 1928, this is when the Department of Commerce really takes off, trying to standardize all of these routes. And if you remember the previous route kind of went over here through Nevada a little further before cutting in. This is the first time that the airmail route comes through St. George, Cedar City, and then connects back up to the original mail route. And they had these really detailed charts. The maps were probably like 10 feet long, so if you're trying to figure out where you're at while you're flying.
Wow.
I don't think they had co-pilots at that time, so you really, but it was basically how can you get through this terrain without hitting something? And what altitude you needed to be at in order to do that. And everything was marked. They had, if there was a military base, a commercial field, these intermediate fields, which I'll talk about a little more because we do have a couple of those. And then the beacon, if it was a flashing beacon, a revolving beacon, and they were marking this entire route from Los Angeles to Las Vegas, all the way up to Salt Lake. So for folks down in Washington County, this one here is on state land actually. So I didn't go and document it just because we don't have jurisdiction out there. But they also did a pretty good job documenting it in 1992. This is just north of Bloomington on that landform, just north of the Virgin River. And you can kind of see this is one of the concrete eras that they really invested in heavily in 1928. The tower would have gone here in the middle, and you would have had a generator shack on the back. Maybe if they were closer to town, they wouldn't have had a generator shack. They would have just had power line going there from the nearest power source because they were easier to get to. So going north is actually the next one. Some of you may have been up here. This is on Chenal-Kaib, and this landform, you can see that's where the previous beacon was, out that way to the southwest. This is where the next beacon will be, which we'll talk about, out towards Quail Creek Reservoir. And then there's another arrow that way. So if anybody's been out to these areas, they're pretty high up, they're pretty difficult to get into. If you can kind of see, there's some burrows here, trailing up a peak in Arizona, and they are taking water up to the top of that landform, which is too steep to haul in or build a road to it, because they needed the water to mix the concrete for the foundation. So they really invested a lot in this, and it's just kind of interesting that once they were done, obviously they're not going to take the concrete with, but they took everything else with. They took the tower with, they took the generator shack, because all of that worked, and they probably sent it to military bases at the time.
were the arrows painted originally?
They would have been painted. So the towers, at least in the west, would have been painted white and red. The arrows would have been painted yellow with probably a black outline around it to make it pop. And then on top of the generator shed, the roof was painted with the numbers so that if you're flying low enough, you can see what number it is. You can kind of pinpoint on your map where you're at. So the next one here is the Beacon 38. So on the site form, it had already been documented, but the site form, it's the Great Not Quite North arrow that was recorded in the 1990s by my predecessor at the BLM. And it's kind of funny. It says, it doesn't point north, but no one says it's supposed to point north, but maybe it points to where the saucer is hidden. So, but yeah, if you get a chance to go out there, there's a road. It's pretty steep, and access is kind of iffy now that they're developing down there along That's like the old Highway 91, where all the warehouses are coming up.
What is that water? I can't see.
This is, Quail Creek, that's the reservoir, just down there. So it's right on the edge overlooking Quail Creek, so it's really, really pretty area. But again, you can kind of see there's just a concrete arrow. Everything else is repurposed. And then lastly, the only other arrow that we have in this area is up near Black Ridge exit. And it actually shows up on the old 1931 General Land Office map. So the surveyors were still officially surveying land that hadn't actually been mapped before. So this was pretty cool that it showed up, because none of the other ones showed up, because it's just sort of hit or miss as to when they're going to be out there surveying and when this was in use. Another type of feature that shows up in 1928 is a landing field. This one is out in Nada, so I don't know if anybody has been to Nada. There's Nada out there, and it was an old railroad siding, basically between Lund and Milford. There was probably, I think there was a small schoolhouse there at some point, but probably not much. This was established in 1928 as one of those intermediate fields. So one of those, we missed the actual airport, we need to land. Hopefully somebody here will help us out. And you can't really see much of it now. This is kind of the edge of the landing field. The vegetation is pretty much the same, but in 1928 they would have cleared it all. And you can kind of see in this 1960 aerial that it was starting to come back. So the main landing strip was north-south, but you could also potentially, depending on the wind and the strength of the wind, you could take off east-west if you needed to. This is a nice schematic. This is actually a landing field, similar design in Kansas. And we'll get more, look at this symbol right here in the middle. This is usually at the intersection of two landing fields, or two directions that you can land. And again, looking for the old newspapers. An airplane landed at the emergency field in Nada, bringing an inspector to inspect the lights. So, kind of fun what you can find. So here's landing field features. This is Nada on the map here. This is this is Nada here in the landing field. This is that circle with the two lines. Again, on the 1960 aerial, you can kind of see it. This is kind of what it looks like now. It's really, the desert has reclaimed it for the most part, but if you know what you're looking for, you're just walking around where there aren't a lot of rocks, and then you see a bunch of rocks, and you're like, that's weird. Oh, these rocks are in a circle. That's weird. But it's old concrete that's just weathered in place. It would have basically been a circle like this. In Beaver Dam, if anybody's familiar, again, outside of my jurisdiction, but in the Arizona Strip, there is an old landing field, and you can see this is their circle that they had there. This is the old landing strip. The winters are a lot less harsh, so the concrete's still pretty intact down there. And then, I don't know if they had windsocks at the middle of these circles, because I haven't seen them in pictures like this. But my wife was nice enough to pretend to be a windsock. And then also, at Beaver Dam, out of my jurisdiction, but really cool, once you're at the landing field, you kind of figure out, well, where am I? The nice folks at Beaver Dam actually spelled out Beaver Dam with rocks similar to the sea up on the mountain, just not as big. There's a nice north arrow here as well, arrow there. And you can see on the ground the D, A, M, here's the north arrow, and yeah, it's pretty cool. They would have kept that clear so people obviously landing can see it. So in 1937, 1938, some things started to change with the way folks were flying through here, probably to do with being more efficient, because more people are probably sending mail on the ground at that point, so they're trying to cut corners of how do we get from LA closer, without flying as much. So the original airmail route, they kind of cut out Cedar City. You could still get mail coming in, but if you were just going to say go from Vegas to Salt Lake, you probably weren't going to come through here. And airplane technology improved, so you would probably be able to fly a little bit longer. So as you can see here, this is not a landing field in 1937. It's now gone in 1938. So it was gone, it was abandoned. And then basically that land was given back into public use. The Department of Commerce no longer needed it. Nobody would be landing there anymore. They also changed some of the beacon numbers, and then they added new beacons. So here's a new beacon. Like I said, this is our area of interest just northwest of Cedar City, and it wasn't there in 1937, although that map is, trust me, it's not there. Yeah. So this is the main focus of what I've been doing here on the Cedar City field office, is just documenting these two beacons that are northwest, or were northwest of Cedar City, out in the desert, out in the flats, but they're on the high spots, the prominences. And it's Table Butte and Blue Knoll. These numbers are just temporary numbers I gave them. But this is on my hike up to Table Butte. You can see Blue Knoll kind of in the distance. And then here's me at the top of Blue Knoll, and you can see Table Butte in the distance. So I'll just go about what these are, because they don't have concrete arrows. So they're a little bit different than the ones down in Washington County. So what makes these beacon sites different is their remote nature, the lack of concrete. But these were going up all over the place, throughout the West, throughout the everywhere in the U.S. But particularly, there were a lot more remote spots here. So it all started at the bottom. There's a generator shed. So these folks have it on a flatbed, and they're moving it in New Mexico from somewhere to somewhere else. And then they would have had fuel canisters there, basically two giant drums, so that you wouldn't have to, keep up to it. You can come check on it monthly or whenever, next to the shack. They had to run, sometimes they'd be right next to the tower, but as you'll see with Table Butte and Blue Knoll, you really don't want to have to go up and down those landforms more than you have to. So they would install power poles, power lines going up to them, and just run the electricity that was generated here up to the top of the landform. And here's the beacon up here. So this is a shorter beacon, shorter tower, only 15 or 20 feet. Some of them had taller ones, just depended on the wind and access to supplies. So here's the Table Butte beacon site. This is BLM vehicle for scale here. Just a little bit of cartoon rendition to show you what was going on, but they would have come in from either direction to check the fuel, to make sure that the engine is running fine in the generator shed, and then the power would have gone up these poles on a power line to the top of the landform, which is very steep, very, very steep. So here's the generator shed that's at the bottom. You can kind of see here's the foundation of it. There really isn't much left of the shed. They probably took it away, repurposed it when they no longer were using it. But this is what it would have looked like. In the West, it was always painted white with red. Initially in the East, they had it yellow with black lines, and then they standardized that in 1932. So everything became white and red, and you can see here's the beacon number painted on the top of the roof. If anybody's done any kind of wandering in the desert, you find lots of cans and glass and old things like that. This is definitely not your household artifacts that are out here on these sites. So this site basically just had antifreeze cans and paint cans, because you're not really going out here, nobody's living here, nobody's bringing their trash out here, but you are bringing everything you need to repaint it, to upkeep the engine and the motor. So it's very unique artifact assemblage that we find here. So this is the power line going up to the top of Table Butte. I think there were about 9 poles, and all but one of them are still intact here, probably because nobody wanted to go take them down, because it was 60 to 70 degree slopes getting up there. There wasn't really a trail. There may have been at some point for somebody. I don't honestly know how they got them in there. They didn't do it by helicopter. That didn't exist. So it really, really impressive feat of engineering to get those, up there. And as you can see, they must have been pretty bold, working those lines as a lineman on the pole, somewhere, on a site. Yeah, you can see here, here's the desert flat below, and this is just, yeah, it's incredible. So again, you're only gonna really wanna go up here if the light bulb goes out. And you're only gonna wanna go up there once you've made sure it's not the generator that's gone out. So you fix the generator, the light bulb's still out, then you have to climb, then you get to the actual beacon location. So on Table Butte, there's just basically four anchor points. There's a platform built up. It's not entirely clear what type of tower was there. There might have been a wooden tower, might have been maybe just like a narrower tower in the middle with guy lines just holding it in place. It's pretty windy. This was one of those super wind events that we had earlier this spring. So you can just see the dust coming off the desert. And here's a light bulb remnant, double prong, and then an old fuse as well that was found up there. And then the final site I'll talk about is the one on Blue Knoll. Obviously, these are exaggerated. This is not how big they were. This was taken at the southern end of the Nada airfield, and there was a road basically just used to go between the airfield and here to service it. They might have just had somebody who was living in Nada do that contract work. It's pretty far out there, so it's just a nice little side gig. The government's going to pay you to go make sure there's a light bulb every once in a while, take your horse out and go check on it. And so the road would have led to the generator shed that's at the bottom, and then there would have been a power line going up this steep climb to the tower. Here I am at the generator shed foundation, which is a lot less developed than the other one at Table Butte. And here's the road going out to the landing field, that's out there. So really fun at this generator shed, we actually got a paint roller, which I know does not sound that exciting to most people, but when you keep finding red paint buckets everywhere and white paint buckets everywhere, and you see all these pictures of all of these buildings that are no longer there, that were painted white and painted red, then you find the painter's smoking gun, I guess, as you can say, of, wow, they really feel like it just, I don't know, I'm a nerd, so I really enjoyed it. But they had the same antifreeze cans out there. They had the same oil cans. This is a 5-gallon bucket of paint, so they basically just stored them there, I think, and took them up to fix it. And again, the foundation is definitely, they probably just had it on a dirt patch at that point. It was more well developed at Table Butte.
Who paid to maintain it?
Yeah, so that was all Department of Commerce, and that was their Airways division. Yeah, it was a federal program, and they
would hire again local.
They would hire local folks to basically do the repairs and upkeep and make sure that things were good. They would have full-time staff that would probably work certain regions, and they would fly around just to inspect the work every once in a while. But it was definitely up to folks that were local to keep an eye on it.
Was the Nada, the Blue Knoll by Nada built on the hill after the airfield was?
It was built at the same time.
Same time the airfield was built.
Yeah, so heading out of Cedar City, they would have the route, there's smaller beacons along the way that would have just been some of those smaller ones. That would have taken them through Three Peaks over by Iron Springs, and then they would have turned north to go toward Blue Knoll. And if they had missed their stop or they were having issues coming out of Cedar, they could land in Nada. And then, yeah, but the actual interesting thing is the Blue Knoll site, the beacon remained in effect until the 1967, I believe. So the landing field was no longer being used after 1938, but they definitely kept this one going until 1967. And then I think they probably got better technology and didn't necessarily need them as much. So here's the hike up to the top. You can barely see there's the vehicle down there. That's where the generator shed would have been. Here's our road to the airfield, which was out here. Can't really see it, but the railroad is out here in this flat. This one, for some reason, they did take all the power poles. So I guess it was just not as steep for them. So basically it's just a bunch of stumps that they left, and they hauled off the poles, and most of the insulators have been picked over. Some of them have been set up on the stumps. So, but yeah, again, pretty steep to get up there. So you really want to make sure that everything's in working order at the base before you start that hike. And then finally, here's the top of Blue Knoll. This one actually does have the steel footers. These are spaced the same as the steel footers at the concrete arrow sites. So those were all sawed off basically at the bottom. These, it looks like they removed from the bolts and just left them in there. So this would have had probably a full tower. And this is sort of looking out towards Milford. You can kind of see the minerals in the background over here. And I'll show you more pictures. There's a lot of just mangled industrial parts in here. Really cool light bulb. Again, if you were shocked that I was excited about a paint roller, you shouldn't be shocked that I'm excited about finding a light bulb, because everything in the desert gets broken at some point. It can be, you can leave something out there for a week and something will break it probably. So to find a light bulb that's probably 50, 60 years old is pretty cool. And it's a 500 watt, you can't read that, but it's a 500 watt light bulb. Here's an example of what it would have been in the mechanism. This is in a museum in California. But there were two lights here, probably would have been alternating on and off. Anything to really catch the attention, and then also rotating around. So it's pretty neat. And then also in that mangled bit at the bottom of the tower is this old General Electric motor fragment that I'm really curious as to if they abandoned it because they no longer needed it, or if it just got destroyed by lightning and they were like, we're just not going to go back there and fix it. Because there is a lot of melted metal and everything out here, so it wouldn't put it past me to think it got struck by lightning a few times. They did have grounds on them, but if it goes loose, then it messes it up. Here's kind of an example. It's a different brand. This is a Kohler brand, probably for a bigger beacon. But yeah, just sort of give you an idea of sort of what we're looking at here. Any Little Mermaid fans in the house? These sites have a bunch of weird things. So I've got who's its and what's its. I've got thingamabobs, like I don't know what they are. They're just tiny, random, very specific parts that went along with all of these. This obviously looks like the end of a baster or something. Probably for oil and everything. This is another fuse. This is part of a rotating mechanism, probably for the beacon. I'm not sure what these are, but the machines here were very high tech for their time. So they didn't want to waste any fuel, so they turned off during the daytime because you don't need a light during the day when you can see where you're going. So they had basically astronomical calendars built into them of like when the sunrise and sunset was supposed to be throughout the year at this specific location. And so there's a lot of triggers and mechanisms that probably that's what these are, to turn it off, to turn it on, and then there were also radio parts involved. So my neighbor yesterday was just telling me that her father serviced the radio beacon up on Lay Hill here in the 1950s, which is like, again, using local contracts to fix the things that need to get fixed. So there were blips that would go for the radio for the pilot. And basically, it was you're only going to receive the blip if you're within a certain cone of degrees. So probably like maybe 10 degrees. And so if you no longer received the blip, you probably needed to go further east or further west to try to get back into it, so you can hear that on your radio, so you know you're on track.
So the radio, so a certain bandwidth,
Mhm.
right,
Mhm.
signature, the pilots would know that,
Mhm.
and then it's just broadcasting out.
Yeah, and it's only broadcasting out in the direction that a pilot should be coming
It's
from.
in the narrow
Mhm.
focus.
Yeah, and those were usually Morse code. Each on those maps, they had a code next to each of these, and so you would hear the blip, and then you could look at your map and be like, okay, I'm flying at night, I can't see because it's too foggy, there's too much clouds, but I can hear the blip, and it is this letter, and this letter is associated with this, and I know I'm flying this
Just a
way.
couple of letters.
Yeah, so it was pretty unique way of navigating. When you run out of one, hopefully you have another, and hopefully you don't run out of all of the ways to navigate. But yeah, so some of the takeaways that I've gotten from just doing this research is that early aviation, the sites involved with that have really unique histories. There aren't common, you know, we find a lot of archaeology. If you've ever been out into the desert, there's so much archaeology, and a lot of it can boil down into like 3 or 4 different site types, as we call them, whether it's an artifact scatter, like, you know, indigenous artifact scatter, or a more recent, you know, maybe a railroad camp, or a rancher's, you know, camp. But these are really specific, and they're only in a few places on the landscape, so it's pretty cool. And a lot of them were, like the arrows, only used for 10 years. You might have been able to use them a little bit later because the arrow's still there, but if you didn't really know what you were looking at, you're just sort of like, thanks, there's an arrow, I'll keep going that way. And all of the artifacts here are very unique. Like I just showed on those slides, they're industrial artifacts, only used at these types of sites. You're not going to find them anywhere else. So I imagine ordering the parts for some of these might have taken quite a while if something was down. But again, if something was down, all of that would be relayed to the local radio operator, say in Milford or Cedar City or St. George. They would broadcast that and say, hey, we don't have power at such and such beacon. If it's inclement weather, maybe at night you don't want to try to fly it, but you know, until we got it fixed.
So the specifications for the artifact, the industrial things, that was Chamber of Commerce?
Yeah, Chamber of Commerce put all the standards,
US
and there are just tons of bulletins about everything, about like the specifications of how long a landing strip should be, how tall a tower should be, the model of engine that you should use to rotate the beacon. So, and all of that's in like the National Archives, and some of it's available online. But yeah, and they have complex site boundaries. So I like to put a nice little boundary around something, except these are like, here's your generator shed, and then here's where all of their paint cans are, which is somewhere else, and then here's their power line, and here's their, you know, so there's a lot of interesting ways that it's laid out. What I want to keep doing is I want to keep looking for additional sites that are related to this. A lot of the smaller beacon sites I haven't been out to check. I've just been kind of the major ones that are like on top of the landforms. But they did have those smaller ones. Maybe the acetylene boxes are out there. Maybe it would be really cool if we could find, because it does get very windy out there, maybe a wind-driven one. That would be unique. And then maybe work across some of the jurisdictions. BLM is mostly flat out in the West Desert. So a lot of times when people were crashing, it's because they didn't get enough altitude and they were crashing into something. All the high spots belong to the Forest Service. So I'd like to work with the Forest Service, maybe get some permission to go out there and look at some of the crash sites that are out there and see what's left behind and document those if possible. And then I want to write all this up. You know, I want this to be available for folks to learn about and get a more of the context, particularly with like you know, local leaning with more histories that people, you know, maybe not ones that are written down. If anybody has any more information, I'd love to know more about this. My contact's here, and it's on the next slide too. So yeah, at this point, just one more thing, just remember, please, when you're out and about, you can appreciate finding the artifacts, finding and seeing the archaeology, but do not take the archaeology. Please leave it for other people to find. Leave it for the archaeologists to document. If you take it off the landscape, that's the history going away. It's very hard to find any history on a lot of this, so if it's gone, the history's gone, the context is gone. It's just sitting in a shoebox somewhere, or somebody's attic, and it's not really available for anybody to learn from anymore. So, yeah, please take pictures if you can. Try not to post them anywhere with locational information. A lot of phones also have geotags, so make sure if you're doing that, remove the geotags from your photos as well. And again, that's my contact. So, yeah, any questions? I'm here for till 5:30. So, yes.
Are you a pilot?
I'm not a pilot. No, I actually don't like heights.
What do you think of the problems with following? Do you know anything about that?
Oh, I don't know anything about, I mean, I see headlines, but I don't know. I mean, it's just probably growing pains. And again, the thing with all of this is aviation it always started in the private side, right? And the commercial people trying to make money off of aviation, and after the military was using it. So then